Hello, this is Dr. Kevin Garrison, Associate Professor of English in the English and Modern Languages Department here at Angelo State University. And this is the first video in a series of videos on user-centered technology and education. So let's dive right into it here. I'm going to talk about three things today as sort of an introductory video. First of all, I'll talk about my educational background, me as the professor. Second of all, I'll sort of contextualize what we're going to be reading this semester by talking about the course in a general sense. And then specifically, I'll talk about the two readings that we had for this week, the Postman piece and the Johnson piece. So let's start with the first one. Who am I and what is my background? Well, my background is very interdisciplinary, which is good considering that we have a lot of different people taking this course from a variety of backgrounds. When I graduated from high school back in 1999, I initially wanted to get a degree in wildlife management. So I went to Solid Rock State University in Alpine, Texas for a semester and lasted a grand total of 4 months as a wildlife management major. When I was a child, I had sort of romanticized this idea of being a hermit in the mountains somewhere and being a park ranger. I read a lot of Native American fiction when I was a kid. So I had romanticized this idea of living in teepees and riding horses and using bows and arrows and whatnot. And so one of the easiest majors that I could think of that would allow me to get in contact with that root instinct would be to be a park ranger and to do ecological or wildlife management on some level. I didn't fit in with the culture. I was raised in Amarillo, Texas, which is a pretty relatively large city of about 200,000 people. So I was a city person, not necessarily a country person. So I switched over to computer science as my major, and I transferred to Angelo State University in the spring of 2000. My second fallback plan after failing in wildlife management, well, I didn't fail in wildlife management, but after I got out of wildlife management, I switched over to computer science because I had a love of video games. And I thought it would be fun to program games. My favorite game series growing up was the Mario series. When I switched over to computer science, I spent a whole semester working on a Pac-Man game. I wanted to create the artificial intelligence of the ghost within that game. I did fine as a computer science major, but I did not enjoy the tedious aspect of coding C++, so I got out of that and switched over to this one, psychology, which I was a psychology major for a couple of semesters. For a while, I thought I wanted to be a counselor, and when I found out that mostly what counselors do is spend their day listening to troubles and trying to diagnose those troubles and help people through those troubles, it became a little depressing. So I got out of psychology after a few semesters and then switched over to the one I finally graduated with, which was an English degree, specifically a focus on literature and a minor in philosophy. After that, when I graduated in 2003, I went up to Texas Tech and got my master's and PhD in also English fields, specifically in rhetoric and composition at the master's level and technical communication and rhetoric at the PhD level. Now, the reason this all matters is it sort of sets the big picture for what we're going to be doing this semester. This is an image from cognitive science. Cognitive science is sort of an interdisciplinary field. It's sort of a meta-discipline. It's an attempt to take all the disparate fields of study and unite them all into one big question, or an answer to one big question, which is how does the mind work, or how does cognition work? You would think that we would know the answer to that, but we don't. We just have a whole bunch of theories that approximate how the mind works. So I've had experiences with every aspect of this intersecting diagram here, except for the neuroscience aspect. I focused heavily on the origins of people. I was on an archaeological dig a few years back for the Comanches down in Fredericksburg. I've spent time, obviously a lot of time in English. I'm working with how words work. I have a doctoral degree, which a doctoral degree, a PhD by default is a degree in philosophy. And as well, I have background in psychology, helping us understand how the mind works, specifically by analyzing behaviors, and then computer science by an attempt to create an artificial intelligence in a machine. So all of these things together have attempted to answer that one big question of how does the mind work. And ultimately, you can boil it all down into one big word. and that is the word of rhetoric. I have two degrees in rhetoric, and what rhetoric is essentially is an attempt to get into human mind. If you go back 2,500 years ago to Aristotle's book on rhetoric, he defined rhetoric as finding the available means of persuasion, or the art of finding the available means of persuasion. So rhetoric at its core is simply an attempt to get into somebody else's brain, figure out what makes them tick, and then sift through all the potential ways of persuading that person to do something, and then choosing the best means. So a simple example, if you're going to show up in front of a class of students, every moment of that day, especially in the first day of class, is an attempt at persuasion. You want to persuade them that you're an intelligent, functioning human being. So you smile at them, you laugh with them, you shake their hand sometimes if you're in a college class. You dress professionally, you think through very carefully what kind of material you're going to be presenting to them. Am I going to use a PowerPoint or not a PowerPoint? How big is the syllabus going to be? A few pages or multiple pages, etc. So you're working through all these available means of persuasion to choose the best one. And it all begins by thinking about what does the student want, or how does the student think, so that I can persuade them to think that I am a good professor and to persuade them to learn something in that semester. So ultimately, this is the one big word that we're going to be focusing on throughout the semester, is rhetoric, getting into somebody else's brain so that we can change the way that they think. And this is just sort of the backdrop for doing so. So the way that fits into the course is very straightforward. We're going to start with a theory of rhetoric as it is applied to user-centeredness, and then work our way to very practical questions. So we'll start with the big theory of user-centeredness, and we'll define that here in a second. We'll do that for the first week, and then we'll take a couple of weeks for each one of these subsequent books. We'll take a couple of weeks to read The Design of Everyday Things, which is one of the first books in user-centeredness, written by Donald Norman. And he uses that term toward the end in the later chapters of his book. We'll spend some time grappling with how does the mind work. And this is an interdisciplinary class, and I don't know specifically the intellectual and the educational background of all the students. I chose a book that's a little more pop culture. It's not hard and fast neuroscience by any means, but it asks these basic questions of how do we learn? How does memory work? How does forgetting work? How do we store memories? How do we forget memories? Things of that nature. And then we'll take on this last book, Seductive Interaction Design. It's got an interesting metaphor, seduction obviously being a metaphor for sexuality, but we'll take that metaphor and apply it to this question of design. People are motivated heavily by sex, so we're going to apply that to the question of design specifically. How do you take a document and make it seductive, meaning that somebody wants to read it, somebody wants to look at it, it's persuasive. Along the way, for each of these three major readings here, you'll be analyzing an artifact. I'll define that later on in the semester, but in brief, an artifact is anything that you use. A technological artifact. It can be a water bottle, it can be a book, it can be a series of sticky notes, it can be a flyer or a poster that you see in the wall. That's an artifact. And you're going to be analyzing three artifacts this semester. Some of them technological, some of them much more focused on questions of design, specifically in education. And we'll see if we can't use these books as a foundation for analyzing these artifacts and helping us understand what they do well and what they do poorly. So that's my background, that's how it feeds into the course. And one last question, which is this: what does it mean for something to be user-centered? So let's define user-centeredness and then see if we can apply it specifically to these two areas, technology and education, as sort of this big theoretical overview of what we're going to be doing this semester. Let's start with this question. Build it from the ground up. Start down here, like a pyramid. Build it from the ground up. The first thing that we're going to work with is this idea of, published in the 60s, this was James Kenevy's model of writing. It's an extremely simplified version of writing. It's the one that Robert Johnson uses in chapter 2 of this book. It's a beautiful little graphic. It's a brilliant little graphic because it is so simple. It boils all of writing behaviors down into 3 different component parts. When you're creating a text, you have the pool of 3 different areas. You have the reader, you have the writer, and you have the reality. A better word for reality would be within a written field, the context, the context being everything outside of the text. Or a better word might be the situation, the rhetorical situation. That is, why are we writing something? Now, depending upon, the reason this graphic is so beautiful is that depending upon the context, each one of these 3 areas has more of a pull or a power over the text. Here's a simple example. My field of study is technical writing. I teach tech writing classes. Technical writing is driven heavily by these 2 corners of the rhetorical triangle as opposed to this one. The writer is largely non-existent in technical writing. If you're writing operating policies and procedures, you don't get a byline. We don't know who is the author of those documents. If you're writing the information on a shirt tag for how to take care of your clothing, we don't know who wrote that. It was the company. You don't get a byline. If you are putting together a bookshelf and you see a set of instructions, you don't see a name attached to that. So the writer is largely non-existent in technical writing, but it's replaced very heavily by the 2 other areas, which is the context and the reader, or the audience. A set of instructions is driven almost entirely by that big question of, can the reader do something? Can they put together the bookshelf without getting frustrated? Or the context. At the university, we have to have operating policies and procedures that the faculty, staff, and students follow. So the context necessitates that we have these texts. It's not written with the reader in mind because it's very dense language typically. And the writer, again, is non-existent. It's usually multiple people working together to create the text, going through multiple revisions, and you never actually see the person emerging through. If you take another example like that of literature, you'll see that that the power shifts very, very heavily. Simple example, in literature, the writer comes to dominate a little bit more than the reader in the reality. The muse, so to speak, authorial intent. Somebody who's writing a fictional piece like James Joyce's Ulysses, or something more contemporary like J.K. Rowling's series in Harry Potter, or something way back in history like Shakespeare. The writer has a lot of power over the text. They decide what's going in there, what the audience is going to read, and what the audience is going to experience. But even then, the reader and the reality still have some pull over a fictional document. For instance, if J.K. Rowling was to write her series on Harry Potter in the 1700s, she would have been burned at the stake, because witches at that time were not seen as something cutesy and as a protagonist. They were seen largely as antagonists and devil worshippers and whatnot. So the reality has an impact on whether or not the writer can actually even create that text. That context didn't necessitate a Harry Potter being a protagonist and being a witch. So we can take Knievey's model of writing and reconceptualize it slightly and come away with this idea of rhetoric much more heavily, which is this: that anytime you're creating a text, the end goal of creating a text is not to create a text. Let that think in for a second. The end goal of this book is not so that the author can have a byline. The end goal of this book is not so that we have this little orange book out there in the world somewhere. The end goal of this is not necessarily to solve the question, the context that necessitated the writing of it. The end goal of the book always is this right here, is the reader. The reader is the person who decides what happens to it. If you buy a bookshelf and you're putting it together and you're typical, like most people, you throw the instructions to the side. Goodbye instructions. I don't want to read those instructions. I dive right into the process. I try to put it together myself, and if I fail, then I go use the instructions. Except when you're putting together modern furniture, you see dozens and dozens of little small little gadgets, screws, and knobs and whatnot that you've got to figure out where they go, and so the instructions are important. But the reader is the person who's most important in that whole equation. They are the ones who decide whether or not they read the instructions or they don't read the instructions. And so if the instructions are not persuasive enough to draw the reader's attention, to get them to immerse themselves in that text, to answer their question of how do I put this together, then the document has failed. Same thing with a book. If people don't buy the book, then people don't read the book. If people walk past these flyers that are put on the halls of the academic building or wherever building you're at, if they walk past them and they're not drawn into them, then all of this is for naught. The creation of the text, the writer's power, and the context, the thing that necessitates the need for even having a flyer, all disappear unless the reader says, oh, there's a writer's conference? What's that? And they see it. It draws them in, they read it, and then they go to the actual sessions of the writer's conference. So the reader in the rhetorical triangle is the one that has to be persuaded to do something. And so, again, in rhetoric, the point of all of this is to get into the reader's head and create something that hopefully they will use or want to use. Now, Robert Johnson does something really nifty in his 1998 book, User-Centered Technology, which is, in my opinion, the most important book that has been published in technical communication in the last 20 years. And he does the following. He says that if we take this rhetorical triangle, we conceptualize it, put the reader at the center here, and change all of these to a technological system as opposed to a written-based system, then it opens us up to everything outside of just writing studies. So we can take ourselves out of English department and put ourselves into computer science department. We can take ourselves out of English department and put ourselves into business questions. We can take ourselves out of English department and stick ourselves in art departments, etc. And the way that it works is as follows. The designer takes the place of the writer, the person who creates a product, or create an artifact, or create an artwork. Replace the text with the artifact, the thing that's being created, and lastly you replace the reality, the context, with what they're going to be doing or why they need to be doing something, and replace the reader with the user. Now you can apply this model for writing, the rhetorical model, for all artifacts. So something like a water bottle here can now be analyzed in terms of rhetoric. Does this water bottle persuade me to pick it up and take a drink? Does it have the right grip? Does it have the right size for my need? Does it have enough information on the sides here that tell me how much water I'm drinking each day, etc.? Well, it becomes now an artifact that we can analyze in terms of rhetorical theory. And switch from talking about just readers and audiences to people are users of technological systems or technological interfaces. And we can apply this model now to anything. I'll give you several examples very quickly here. Consider the context of computer science. You have programmers who are programming interfaces within the field or the context of computer science. Who should be at the center of the question? The user. Because they're the ones who have to use these interfaces. They're the ones who have to pull up the apps on their cell phone. They're the ones who have to pull up the HTML files on their computers. They're the ones who have to log into Remport, etc. So the user is, in theory, the most important component. But when you talk to people who are programmers, and you ask them, what do you do? Primarily what they say is they code what? They code programs. I'm developing a new interface for our Bank of America website. I'm developing a new application that allows people to access information in real time. We're developing a new Remport so that people can log in and get the information they want quicker. We're doing a whole bunch of different things. We're all fundamentally programming interfaces and artifacts. At no point does somebody turn around and say, well, the user needs X. So me as a programmer am creating an interface that supplies X to them in the form of Y. We just don't hear people talk like that. Here's another context, business. We always hear that horrible adage of the customer is always right. The customer is not always right, but the customer is at the center, or should be at the center of a business. When I was working at Pizza Pro when I was an undergraduate student trying to pay my way through college, At the center of all equations of pizza delivery is something very simple, is that the customer wants to buy a pizza and Coke so they can sit in front of their television at the end of a long day with their children on the floor, all with paper plates, shoving pizza into our pie hole, throw the cardboard away, and we move on with our lives without having a whole bunch of dishes and having a whole bunch of good taste in the process and enjoying the movie that we're trying to watch. At least that was how I was when I was a kid. My family always had a pizza night every once in a while, and it became the Pizza Hut pizza night. You're trying to create an experience as a business for the customer. So the customer says, I love that experience, and I'm coming back to Pizza Hut because they provide that experience that I'm looking for. And so when I was working at Pizza Pro, that's fundamentally what we mean when we say the customer is always right, is that employees don't really matter. The context of trying to make a profit within a business and a restaurant environment doesn't matter. The materials that we use, the pizza boxes, the cutting of the pizza, the coupons that we put in the ads, etc., all these materials don't matter. What ultimately all matters is whether or not the customer is satisfied with their experience so that they come back. Another example, using this idea of rhetoric, then you reconceptualize how we think of parenting. I have a 17-month-old daughter. Her name is Kendall. One of my favorite things in life. She's my pride and joy. So many of us think of parenting as a question of how do we become a parent? How do I be a good dad? That's the wrong question. If you reconceptualize parenting to start with the end, which is the end is children, the end is taking a single cell, waiting 9 months, coming out as an infant, waiting another 18 years, and it's a full-grown, semi-functional adult. We're taking that person and releasing them into the world. That's what a parent is. They're just simply facilitating the process of turning a child into an adult. And so when you reconceptualize this, you're not worried about what are the best methods for parenting. You're not worried about the context of, well, I am a parent, I have a child, I need to be a parent. You're not worried about how am I supposed to be a good parent. That's the irrelevant question. What you're focused on is entirely the end result. What kind of child am I trying to create? And what are the best methods? And how can I best be a parent to facilitate that creation of a child? And then the big one. The title of the class is User-Centered Technology, and the second part is Education. We're going to focus a lot on education because everybody taking this class has a background in education or is planning to be in education on some capacity. So if we reconceptualize education via user-centeredness, via rhetoric, this is what we come up with. It is the whole point of being a teacher, the whole point of being an administrator, is to help the student go from the introduction of the class where they don't know X, and by the time they get out of that class, they know X plus Y. That's the goal of being in education, right? Unfortunately, the government steps in. Y'all know this probably better than I do, but they step in with their teaching tools, their administrative tools, and say, well, you need to teach to the standardized test, because ultimately the standardized test is what we use to evaluate whether or not the teacher is a good teacher, which we then evaluate whether or not education is taking place, and then we take that data and we refine our tools, create a new or better standardized test so that we can continue to evaluate our teachers, so that we can ensure that students are learning something in an educational environment, and then continuing to do this process ad infinitum, ad nauseum, constantly. What would our lives be like if when we create a syllabus, or we create a Blackboard interface, or we design a web page, or we create assessment tools? What would our lives be like if we put the student at the center of these equations? How might education change if the user, albeit the student, is put at the center of these technological discussions? So that's the introductory lecture. That's where we're going for the introductory lecture. That's where we're going with this semester. When we talk about it next week, we'll see if we can't take on this question in a more theoretical sense. That is, we'll grapple with why do we even need something to be user-centered in the first place. I hope you enjoyed it, and goodbye. I'll see you next week.